Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another Video Fish by podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Alicia J. Batten. Alicia Batten received her bachelor's in humanistic studies from McGill University and completed a master's degree and PhD at the University of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses upon the origins and development of early Christianity, with particular emphasis upon the ancient Mediterranean cultural context, including material culture. She also thinks it is important to study the shifting manner in which biblical texts are interpreted over the centuries. Is currently writing a commentary examining the text reception and impact of the letter of James. Beyond her academic interests, Alicia enjoys gardening, hiking, art, and reading works of fiction poetry. Currently, Alicia J. Batten is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Theological Studies at Conrad Grebel University College at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. Her current research interests include the Catholic epistles, especially James, ancient economics, dress, and antiquity, and the history of biblical interpretation. So welcome to the History Valley podcast, Professor Alicia Batten.
I'm very glad to be here.
So how does the Epistle of James portray friendship and benefaction?
Yes, well, first maybe I'll say a few words just about ancient understandings of friendship, because ancient philosophers, Greek philosophers, wrote a lot, quite a bit, about the whole idea of ideal friendship in the ancient world. So you have people like Aristotle, whom I'm sure people have heard of Aristotle, Plutarch, other writers who really idealized friendship. And there were a variety of different characteristics of true friends. For one, they spoke plainly or frankly to one another. So friends were not flatterers. They didn't simply say what their friend wanted them to hear. Rather, they would sometimes offer edification to one another because they wanted to be helpful to one another. So friends were honest and they spoke clearly and plainly to one another. Some friendships traditions talk about sharing possessions in common, so not being greedy. They talk about speech, as I said, speaking plainly, being honest, being open to reason. There were other kinds of virtues that were characteristic of friendship. So, for example, not being jealous of one another or envious of one another. And there's an interesting phrase that shows up in some of the Greek literature. Friends were to be one soul. Mia suke is the term used. It can mean one soul or one mind with one another. So you find that tradition popping up again and again when people write about friendship in the ancient world. So I thought it was interesting when you read the letter of James, you find some of these virtues. So James spends quite a bit of time talking about proper speech. He's quite, I'll say he, because I think it's probably, I don't know who wrote James, but probably a man. Um, James talks about speech and he's very suspicious of the tongue. The tongue can cause a lot of evil. It can direct the whole body in the wrong direction, but he's very careful or he provides clear instruction about how his audience is to speak to one another. So he's very concerned about that. He stresses the importance of people caring for the poor. So in chapter 2, we have this whole scenario where a well-dressed man with gold rings comes into the assembly, and then a poor man is there as well. And James says to his audience, well, you give the best seat to the well-dressed man, but you tell the poor man to sit at your feet. And he says, you've dishonored the poor when you do that. And he stresses that it's the poor who receive the kingdom. So James is very concerned about the poor and about sharing, caring for widows and orphans, about sharing with the poor. He derides people who say, go now, be filled, without actually giving them material support. So he is very concerned about that. Um, James's voice as well is very straightforward. It's very frank. Some people have even described the letter as kind of barking at the audience. So it reflects this emphasis on frank speech. But then there are other virtues that James stresses. So it tells its audience not to be envious, not to be jealous. It stresses loyalty. It says they shouldn't boast. Um, James also has an interesting detail in chapter 5. He says that people shouldn't swear oaths. And that's interesting because you do find in Plutarch, an ancient Greek writer, this whole idea that friends shouldn't swear oaths because swearing oaths, it was more characteristic of the flatterer. The flatterer would, repeatedly stress and swear to do this or that. That's not how a friend should be. A friend doesn't need to do that. A friend should be trustworthy. So it's interesting that that shows up in James as well. And then we get some explicit friendship language. So, for example, in chapter 4, uh, James says that friendship with the world is enmity with God. And God, I think, is portrayed as an ideal friend and benefactor. God gives generously, it says in James. God is described as simple in the sense that God is straightforward. So haplos is the term, the Greek term used there for simple, and that means there's no ulterior motive. You don't have to guess why God is giving generously. God doesn't have some other, God is not. God doesn't have some kind of um, strategy or something that God is hiding behind God's back that you have to be worried about. God is simple in the sense that God is straightforward and provides for the community like a true benefactor should. So I think this whole notion of friendship with God is present in James. And that's interesting. You do find that a little bit among Stoic writers, but it's more from Hellenistic Judaism that you find this notion of friendship with God. It's not something that was typical in Greco-Roman texts. So those are just a few ways I think that James shows an awareness of and actually emphasizes these themes related to friendship, which again were ideal. This notion of friendship was idealized in the ancient world.
Is the letter of James claiming to be written by James, the brother of Jesus himself, or a different James?
Well, that's a much disputed question. There's no consensus about authorship of James. Um, In fact, there's even evidence that in the early church, some early church writers were unsure who wrote the letter of James. So the whole idea that James may not be authentically by James of Jerusalem is not a new idea. Martin Luther, who you may know, notoriously stated that James was a letter of straw, an epistle of straw. Um, he didn't think it was written by James of Jerusalem. He towards later in his life, he said he admitted there were some good teachings in it, but overall he didn't like the letter of James very much. um, and so there continues to be discussion about this. I don't think it's by James of Jerusalem, James the brother of Jesus, also known as James the Just or James the Righteous. I think it's claiming to be by that James because this whole notion of writing in the name of somebody else was a widespread idea within the ancient world. There's nothing unusual about that. And there were other texts within the Christian tradition that claimed to be by James, and nobody thinks that James actually wrote them. So that idea of attributing something to James, it would not be so strange. Um, and also, several scholars think that James probably knew First Peter, another letter in the New Testament, and First Peter is typically dated to late first century. First Peter also claims to be by an apostle, claims to be by Peter, but it's one of the few texts in the New Testament that actually uses the word Christian, Christianos, and it would have taken a while for that term to develop. And when you compare James to First Peter, you notice that they both cite some of the same texts from the Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, roughly in the same order. But First Peter's citations are longer. He has more from the Septuagint than James does. So many people think James actually cites First Peter, and so that would place James later, into the late first or perhaps even early second century. Hard to know for sure. And then within the Christian tradition, of course, we don't have any originals of any texts of the New Testament, but within the Christian tradition, we don't see James explicitly cited as scripture until a Christian named Origen of Alexandria, a Christian who wrote quite a bit. But he clearly sees James as scripture, so you don't see that till later on. And so I don't think James could be by James of Jerusalem, who was understood to have been martyred, sometime in the 60s. I think James is later than that, but is claiming to be by this James because this would give the letter of James a lot more legitimacy. And it also, as some interpreters have pointed out, quite helpfully, it also contributes to the memory of James of Jerusalem. So he would be remembered as someone who, provides these sorts of ethical teachings. And the text is in pretty good Greek. So he'd be remembered as a kind of literate teacher, because the author mentions being a teacher in the letter of James. So that's my take, at least, but just want to emphasize that I think scholars are all over the map, continue to debate quite a bit about the authorship of the letter.
Why do you refer to James chapter 1, verses 2 to 18 as the Exordium?
That's yeah. So exordium is the term used amongst ancient writers to refer to the beginning of a letter, which usually introduces some key themes or key ideas that will be developed later on in the text. So there are several ideas at the beginning of James in chapter 1 that talk about various issues that will then come up later on in the text. So, for example, the notion of a generous God and the importance of relying on God and not disputing with God, but being of one, not being double-minded. James uses this term double-minded, which I think is probably in contrast to being one mind or one soul. So again, drawing from the friendship tradition there. You see this, if I didn't mention it, this reversal of rich and poor, which is something that will come up later on throughout the letter. Um, you see this notion of faith and action being both hearers and doers of the word. So it's a kind of a fancy way of saying it's like a table of contents for the letter of a whole, and a way of introducing some key ideas, key themes that will be developed, so that the audience knows, okay, here we're going to hear more about these things as they listen to the letter, because they probably would have heard it read aloud.
Can you talk about James 3:13, verse 410, containing much positive exhortation for the life of the community? And how does it remind you of Aristotle?
Did you say James 3:14?
James 3:13 to 4:10.
Okay. Yes. Well, here, this is this notion of receiving wisdom from above. That this chunk really emphasizes the importance of receiving wisdom from above. That is wisdom from God. So we get I think, quite a beautiful description of wisdom, which James wants the audience to receive from God. And then, in contrast, if one does not receive wisdom, James describes all the kind of disputes, the jealousy, the envy, all these kinds of things that you see discussed by some of these ancient Greek philosophers, these kinds of characteristics that are not typical of friends. So James is contrasting receiving wisdom from God, who's the ideal friend and benefactor, which is characterized by these virtues associated with friendship versus not. And in that state, if one does not receive this, one is not receptive, if one does not receive this wisdom, then all kinds of fighting and tensions and bitter disputes will break out in the community. And so James spends quite a bit of time talking about this in chapters 3 and 4. He talks about how people don't know how to ask God properly for wisdom, that they ask wrongly, as he says, and they he says you just fall prey to your passions, which he's very critical of. He says they're unfaithful. He says friendship with the world is enmity with God, so they're polar opposites to one another. And so he continues to stress the importance of submitting themselves to God, and that God will draw them near.
Can you talk about James 3:18 and Matthew 5:9 being in fact the only two New Testament texts to address peacemaking, and that they're similar in their thinking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that really gets us into this question of what is James's relationship to the teachings of Jesus as found in the Gospels, especially Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And many interpreters, and again, this goes way back because you find readers of James, even in the early church, noticing all these comparisons or these parallels between the letter of James and the teachings of Jesus, especially those teachings found in the Sermon on the Mount, which is in Matthew. And then we have a Sermon on the Plain in Luke. And so here I'll just mention that, some of your listeners may be familiar with the whole idea of Q. Q is short for Quelle, which means source in German. And for a couple hundred years now, there's been this idea that when you compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which together are called the Synoptic Gospels, you notice that there are literary parallels in the Greek. And so there's some kind of literary relationship between those three gospels, because how do you explain exact word for word parallels sometimes in the Greek other than somebody's copying from someone else? And so the most common solution, again, no consensus, there's always disagreement here. The most common solution is that Mark was used by Matthew and Luke as a source, but that Matthew and Luke also had another source that Mark did not use, and that source is Q or Quella, just called source, and it's primarily teachings of Jesus. Because you find in Matthew and Luke sometimes word for word parallels in Greek that are not in Mark. And so how do you explain that? It can't just be oral tradition, because if you and I go out and hear a conversation and then come back inside and decide to write it down, we're going to write it down differently because we'll have different writing styles. We're different people. We won't write it down word for word. But if we're using a text and we're told you have to go, or at least we try to copy a text, we're more likely to have word for word parallels. So this is the whole idea of Q, which is a hypothetical source. But many people think James knew some form of Q. Now, perhaps a form of Q that's somewhere between, some proto-Q and sort of the Q Matthew direction, because we find some details in James, for example, not swearing oaths and peacemaking and so forth. Well, especially the not swearing oaths that is only in Matthew. It's not in Luke. But it's it's thought by many, and again, not by everybody, but many people think James doesn't necessarily know the Gospels because, well, for one, James doesn't have anything about the death and resurrection of Jesus. There's nothing about, for example, baptism or a meal, like a common meal together, like the Last Supper. Nothing about that in James. And then you do find this interesting, James talks about prayer, but if he knew Luke, who also loves the topic of prayer, when Luke talks about prayer, he often mentions the Holy Spirit. James doesn't do that. So you would think James might do that if he knew Luke. And then Matthew will associate the kingdom of heaven with the poor in spirit. That's in the Sermon on the Mount. James does that in chapter 2. He associates the kingdom with the poor, but he doesn't say kingdom of heaven, and he doesn't say poor in spirit. He just leaves it at the poor. So that suggests some, at least, and here I'm building on the work of John Kloppenborg, it suggests that James probably doesn't know the Gospels, but does know some source that the Gospel writers also used. And so that might help explain why we see this parallel between James 3:18 about peacemaking or peace and the Gospel of Matthew.
Are there other parallels between Matthew's form of Q and the letter of James?
Yeah, so for example, the oath one would be a really important one, I think, to stress. Do not swear oaths, because that doesn't show up in Luke. And here I would recommend work by Patrick Harton. He wrote a book some time ago called James and the Q Sayings of Jesus, in which he pays particular attention, to those to James and James and Q Matthew, as he calls it.
With James 5:13 to Q 6:24, you mentioned here that the comparison centers upon a critique of the rich and the warning not to store up treasures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be another good comparison between James and Q. James is pretty, James is pretty exaggerated there in chapter 5, when he talks about how their riches have rotted, their garments are moth-eaten. He says their gold and silver have rusted. So that's pretty exaggerated because those metals don't rust. And he goes after them for laying up treasure. And we find that, of course, in traditions related to Q and the criticism of those who lay up treasure for themselves. So, that would be another good example of a parallel between the two, between James and this hypothetical text.
So moving back to the friendship and benefaction, can you tell us about the challenge to patronage in James 2:1-13 to
Sure.
14:26?
Yeah, so a number of interpreters, this goes back to an article, I think, by Nancy V. Meister some time ago. She first noticed this idea that when you look at this scenario in James chapter 2 that I mentioned before, so we have James describes, I don't think it's a real scenario, but a possible scenario in which the community has gathered into, and here he uses the term synagogue, get the word. James also will use the term ecclesia or church, but here he uses the term synagogue, and he describes a man with gold rings in fine clothes who comes in to the synagogue, and then a poor man who wears, it says shabby clothing, or it actually says dirty clothes. So he's really trying to make it clear that these men are materially different. One is wealthy and one is poor. And then James goes after the audience, and he says, here's how you treat the rich man, the man with fine clothing. You give him, you offer him the best seat, and where you sat in the ancient world mattered, whether you were in a courtroom or whether you had a meal. And then he says, you say to the poor guy, sit there, sit at my feet. And he says, you've made distinctions, you've shown partiality to the rich here, and you've become judges, he says, with evil thoughts. So then he goes on and he says, God's chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he said, he asked this as a kind of rhetorical question. He says, hasn't God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him? So Meister and subsequent interpreters, including myself, think that this is a typical scene of a patron coming into an assembly. I happen to think it's probably a courtroom. And, as you find these kinds of descriptions amongst other ancient writers, one's wealth was easily advertised through the way that they dressed. And so if you have a well-dressed man with gold rings coming in and being given, the best seat and treated so well, that would be typical treatment of a wealthy patron. And in ancient Rome, this notion of patronage was widespread, whereby you had wealthy patrons who had a fair bit of power. They were in relationship with clients, and it was a reciprocal relationship. So the patron might provide perhaps work or money or protection, and then the client had to provide honor or labor or whatever the patron wanted them to do. And this could slide into exploitation. The ancient world was a deeply hierarchical kind of context in which clients could potentially be expected to do more and more for their wealthy patron. So I think, as building from Meister and others, I think that here James is describing a kind of typical scene whereby this patron comes in and can just expect to be treated well, and James is criticizing that kind of behavior. He's going against it, and he's saying, look what that does. That dishonors the poor. And then he goes on to say later, he says, it's the rich who drag you into court. It's the rich who oppress you. And he says, they blaspheme, he says, even the honorable name invoked over you. So James is challenging patronage, which would be something in the ancient world. And he's doing so by means of this kind of imagined scenario, which would have been something I think James's audience must have been familiar with wherever they were.
Why do you think that James is, in certain circumstances, avoiding discussing the faith of Jesus?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, in 2:1, he says, my brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. Like, this is a tricky one because this reference to the Lord Jesus Christ, it's kind of awkward in the text. Some people think it might be a later addition to the text, so that the text didn't actually refer to it originally. So I'm not sure about that, but here at least you do have a reference to if it is authentic, you do have a reference to the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ. But then, you don't get really anything else about Jesus's faith throughout the letter. But here, at least, if it is authentic, then I think it's saying something about, Jesus's faith does not, since this, introduces this whole scenario about patronage. Jesus's faith, his trust, his loyalty, is does not manifest itself by showing partiality to the rich man. So James is aligning his ethics with the faith of Jesus in this case. But then the question, why, the faith of Jesus, and why doesn't James spend more time talking about Jesus in his letter? Yeah, that's a really, really good question. It could have something to do with James's audience. Who were they? We don't know for sure. There have been, you know, where the letter was written to, that says it's written to the 12 tribes in the diaspora or this dispersion. Where they were is unclear. I think they're probably urban, given the kinds of details we find in the letter, and details that urbanites would be familiar with, like crowns and teachers and all this wealth. This is something urbanites, I think, would be accustomed to hearing about. um, but why James doesn't talk more about uh, what happened to Jesus. Rather, James is really aligning his voice with the teachings of Jesus, which would not be so strange. There are other ancient writers who would use a prior text or tradition. Richard Bauckham has shown how, for example, Ben Sira uses Proverbs, and will use traditions from Proverbs but restate them in his own way. John Kloppenborg has shown, specifically with regard to James, how there was this ancient practice of paraphrasing, or what's called emulatio, whereby a writer would draw on the teachings of a former wise person or a former philosopher, but restate them in his own words to suit his own context, but that the audience would know that those traditions came from this prior writer. And so that would further strengthen the argument of the author of the letter, because he's showing his wisdom is consistent with the wisdom of this great teacher, in this case of Jesus. So who these people were, some have argued, well, maybe they were a mixed group. Maybe they are a mixture of Jews, because James is a very Jewish letter, um, and Jewish Christians. And so maybe the author doesn't talk about things like the death and resurrection because he knows that simply wouldn't be of interest to the Jews in the community, and that could be a divisive kind of issue. Um, so it's hard to answer that question. It's a really good question, but I think it's one of the things that makes James so interesting within the New Testament canon.
So rather than believing that the letter of James knows Matthew, you think it knows something, a version of Q perhaps that's similar to Matthew's version of the sayings of Jesus. But the thing that I think you also note this is that in certain circumstances, the parallels between Q, Matthew, and James aren't even exact. In some cases, there are a little bit of differences. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and again, this would go back to, I mean, who knows what that looked like, right? We don't have it, which is the problem. We don't have Q Matthew, so we don't know exactly what it looked like. Um, but again, this ties in with this whole notion of paraphrasing. James changes things, and that's because he's writing to different people than to whoever Q was addressed to, or for that matter, people whom Jesus addressed. If these teachings, some of these teachings, at least if they're authentic, um, James is writing to a different audience. So he has to adapt his teachings to suit the context he's writing for. People won't listen to him if he's talking about things that really aren't relevant to them. So I think he's restating things and altering things, editing things in order to have the specific teaching fit within his overall aims, and be comprehensible to his audience. And I think, like, for as an example, James 4:4, which talks about friendship with the world being enmity with God. I think this could be um, I'll just read it. He says they're adulteresses. Don't you know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. I think this could be drawing from Q 1613, which is like the Lucan numbering, but this is that teaching about how no one can serve two masters. One cannot serve God and mammon. I think it makes sense that James doesn't talk about mammon, for example, because mammon was an Aramaic term for wealth. And if he's writing to urbanites, he's writing to people who have to have some wealth, they have to have some money to survive in a city, which were more monetized. And so he's not going to talk about mammon. Maybe they don't even know Aramaic anyway. But he changes it to talk about friendship, which is, drawing from this philosophical tradition about friendship. And if these are wealthier people living in an urban center, these kinds of philosophical ideas might resonate with them quite a bit. Whereas talking about, serving two masters and God and mammon just wouldn't be a kind of phrasing that would that they might deem to be as relevant as talking about this kind of relationship between them and God as one of friendship. So that would just be an example of how and why James might change things, because, he's writing to a different context.
And my closing question, is the letter of James generally more Jewish than Christian in certain circumstances?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In many ways, yeah. I mean, it draws from the Septuagint. I think it shares many ideas with Hellenistic Judaism. But, it's really hard to separate all these traditions in the ancient world, because Christian traditions are indebted to Hellenistic Judaism. Christianity is indebted, obviously, to Judaism. So I find that I'm kind of on the fence there. It's hard to distinguish, really. James, I think, is informed by Greco-Roman philosophical traditions. Some think that James may reflect specific Stoic ideas. And so that idea of blending all these different traditions, including Hellenistic Judaism, including Stoicism, other Greco-Roman traditions, and then, of course, teachings of Jesus, which, of course, Jesus was obviously a Jew, right? So he's, James has blended all of these things together. So it's in the Christian New Testament. So it's been certainly a text that has become part of the Christian tradition. But I think it's really good it's there in the New Testament, because it continually forces interpreters to go back and think about this whole idea, for lack of a better term, of Jewish Christianity, which is, not a very good term, but, there were ancient traditions which survived for centuries of Christians who were Jews. But, with Paul and the spread of the church in the Gentile world, really dominating, we don't have as many texts and traditions from this Jewish Christianity, as at least that have survived. So I think James is an example of that, and that it continually opens up a window for us to explore those traditions, which were so important to the development of the early church.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Alicia Batten.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good to be here.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.